Okay, so in a previous video, I talked about monopolistically competitive firms. In this one, I want to touch on oligopoly and monopoly. And the key thing that differentiates a monopolistically competitive firm from an oligopoly are barriers to entry. Barriers to entry are things that keep competition out of the market in some fashion. And so when we think about an oligopoly, we've got a few main characteristics here. A few large firms dominate the market. And in fact, a lot of the things that we buy every day probably are in oligopoly markets. Soft drinks are an oligopoly. Cell phones are an oligopoly. Uh, Car makers are an oligopoly. Uh, Airline travel, oligopoly. Lots of things out there where you just have a few large firms that dominate the market. Now, these firms are price makers, and because there are things called barriers to entry, there is a greater potential for long-term profit. With an oligopolist, you also have the potential for collusion. You'll also see quite a bit of advertising and branding, and a key in an oligopoly is non-price competition. So let's talk a little bit more about these barriers to entry. A few things that can be significant barriers to entry would be economies of scale. Some businesses are able to either produce, if they're a manufacturer, or they're able to buy product in such bulk that they get volume discounts so they can sell the product cheaper than the competition. A good example of this that we're probably all familiar with is Walmart. Everyday low prices, right? Well, part of the reason why they can have everyday low prices is because they buy so much product from the manufacturer that they get really good deals that they can then pass on to the consumer. So that's one potential barrier. Another big one is ownership of key resources. So if you own all of the oil wells that pull the oil out of the ground, you have a natural advantage in gasoline production. There are also legal barriers like trademarks and patents, for example. A big one is high capital investment. So there are some industries that are very expensive to try to break into, and it's just cost prohibitive to do so. An example would be airlines. It takes a lot of money to try to compete nationally as a brand of airline. And another thing that's actually a pretty good barrier is good, strong brand identity. And I would say, as an example, Apple is really good at this. Apple has a very strong brand, and they have managed to fend off challengers. And one example that I talk about in my face-to-face classes quite a bit is before iPhones were really a thing, iPods dominated MP3 players. And so, of all people, Microsoft came out with a product to try to compete with the iPod. This product was called the Zune, the Zune. And they were in the market for a few years and then fizzled out. The reason being is that people were already so strongly integrated into the Apple ecosystem and iTunes that they didn't switch. And a lot of textbooks will refer to that as a network effect, where because you're used to the ecosystem and all the things that go with it, you don't switch to something else. It's the same reason why, even though I personally hate my cable company, my wife won't switch to something else because she doesn't want to learn new channels. God love her. All right. Uh, so that's a little bit more on oligopolies. As I said, one feature of an oligopoly is the potential for collusion. What that is where a few big companies get together and they fix prices, um, and they kind of work in tandem. Now, the problem with collusion in the United States, there's two. One, it's illegal. And number two, there are strong incentives for firms to undercut each other in this process. And part of that is there's really no legal recourse. Let's take an example here. Let me see what I've got in my office. So let's say there's only a few big manufacturers of textbooks, but let's say that they got together. So let's say Cengage and McGraw-Hill and Norton and Pearson all got together and decided, you know what? Let's raise the prices of textbooks 40% together. We'll blame it on supply chain or something else. Well, if everybody goes along with it and nobody gets found out, maybe that works. But there are incentives for one person to break ranks and maintain prices, because if the consumer is price sensitive, they will switch from the higher priced products to the lower priced products, which is going to help the one that basically doesn't go along. And it's not as if the other folks can say, hey, this group, this person, this company backed out of this illegal deal that we made. So you've got that. Now, in terms of what all this looks like from a optimality standpoint, it's pretty much the same process as monopolistically competitive. The key difference that you're likely to see is that because there are a lot of monopolistically competitive firms, an individual producer or firm in a monopolistically competitive market is likely to have a more elastic demand curve or tend to be flatter, while an oligopolist will have more inelasticity. And that goes back to when we were talking about elasticity in the course. One of the main things that helps to determine whether a product is elastic or inelastic is the availability of substitutes, price availability of substitutes. And with an oligopoly, there's simply fewer of them. And that kind of brings me to a topic that I want to touch on just a little bit. And that is, let me find the slide, mergers and acquisitions. How do firms get bigger and bigger? Well, a lot of times they do what's called a consolidation or merger. And so there are three different types that we can talk about. The first is a horizontal, and a horizontal merger is firms that are on the same level of production. So a good example of that would be Walmart and Target. They're both final sellers of merchandise. Sprint and Verizon, they're both cell phone providers. That'd be an example. Vertical, they're on different levels of the production cycle. And so an example would be Purina, which manufactures pet food, being bought by PetSmart. You could have Amazon, for example, and a specific producer of a product. Another example would be if Apple bought Verizon. Then you could have some exclusivity in terms of different offerings of cell phones and whatnot. And then, of course, you have a conglomerate. And conglomerate are where you kind of have unrelated firms that are under the same corporate umbrella, almost like a stock portfolio. And a good example of this is RJ Reynolds and Nabisco, two companies that make very different products that are under the same corporate leadership. And when we think about mergers and acquisitions, this is where the concept of the consumer welfare standard comes into play. Once upon a time, we used to have what's called the rule of reason, where uh, regulators would just look and see, well, how big would market share become if firms merged together? And we didn't want firms to get too big. Well, since around the 1970s, what has been applied by antitrust is what we call the consumer welfare standard. And the consumer welfare standard simply looks at, is the merger going to potentially reduce quality to the consumer or raise prices? And particularly when we're dealing with big tech companies, it is really hard to oppose a merger when you're looking at the consumer welfare standard. Because if you think about things like Facebook, well, Facebook is free. They just pump you full of ads and push an algorithm your way, but you don't actually pay for anything. So there's really not a way to prevent Facebook from buying Instagram, for example, because there's no perceived harm to the consumer. So anyway, that's oligopoly. Again, give you a quick recap. The major difference between monopolistically competitive and oligopoly. Oligopoly, there are a lot fewer firms. They are bigger. They're producing differentiated products. And there are significant barriers to entry to keep out competition. And what that means is that they have a greater chance to earn long run economic profits by being in that industry and having those barriers. That doesn't mean that they're going to be successful into perpetuity. There are several businesses that I grew up with that would be considered oligopolies at one point that eventually fizzled out and are no longer around. Uh, a big one that comes to mind is Blockbuster. Blockbuster used to dominate video rentals. They were part of, the American landscape, and now they're kind of a footnote in history. So, all right, that's oligopoly. We'll look at a little bit more on monopolies in a later video.